Okay, we're going to start. I'll try to keep my eye on the screen for those who are still coming in. One more. Okay, this is a more heavily Zoom-oriented group tonight, but it's delightful to have everybody wherever you happen to be. I can't see you all at the moment, but that's because we have this text that are up here, but we will try to change that a little bit later on. So this is our last opportunity to gather, at least in this setting. I hope that some of the ideas that we have been presenting, which is just a small snapshot of really what is available as part of our entire array of the Jewish experience, will be a source of some enrichment for everyone. This is a scratching of the surface. A lot more could and I hope will be said down the road in the times to come. I wanted to move today to something that, again, is on one hand familiar to us. We encounter certain institutions, certain practices, certain ideas all the time, but maybe not with quite the specific orientation we would expect. And again, we are talking about the idea of looking at a similar panorama very often, but through very different lenses. Not only the lenses of individuals who encounter it in real time, but also in the sense of those who are encountering the various ways in which Jews throughout the ages have encountered a variety of experiences and ideas. And this includes everything from Jewish practice to God, and even beyond that. So what I thought would be important for us to be able to see today is something, again, that starts with a familiar experience for us, but has a little bit of a different twist. And that is the idea of Shabbat. Any more? Okay. So just to review, the experience of Shabbat in the Torah and the Bible as a whole, the Tanakh as a whole, is kind of limited. We have far, far more law, explanation, analysis, evaluation, if you will, after the Hebrew Bible is closed, and we do in the Tanakh itself. But at the same time, you get a sense that there is something central. It is the only holiday that's in the Ten Commandments. You would expect Pesach to be there. You might expect Rosh Hashanah to be there. There's nothing. No mention of either one. It is instead the holiday of Shabbat, but it's presented in two ways. The one that is more cosmic, if you will, is in the version of the Ten Commandments that we find in Exodus. Right? The rationale for observing the Shabbat in the book of Exodus is 6 days God created everything. Seventh day God rested. So God stops creating, you should stop creating. And it flows from there. And it's really closely related then to the experience of the building of this tabernacle, this sanctuary in the wilderness, because the same language that is used in Genesis to talk about the building of the creation of the world is used to describe the building of the sanctuary. So it's as if there's a miniature creation epic taking place in this sanctuary building. And anyone who's ever worked on a synagogue building campaign knows how true this is. Right? It's a big undertaking. Nice and loud, please, so we can.
6 days to go to work, 7 days. So the whole world now celebrates a week, 7 days. That would be Sunday. That's where the 7 days derive from.
Ostensibly, yes. Other calendars and other cultures develop other kinds of weeks. And for example, the Babylonians, who predated the Israelites, had a 10-day week, we think. And other cultures had played with the calendar as well, including the French as part of the Revolution. They're still fighting over stuff. So there is some variety, but as a contribution to civilization, that is major, that 7 day week. And course, there would be a differentiation between what is the most important day of the week, whether it is the sixth day, the seventh day that we encounter as Sabbath, or the Lord's Day as the Christian world embraced it for Sunday, which is a different issue. But the thing that's important for us to realize, I think, is that an unusual kind in its presentation is that there's a second rationale for the idea of the Sabbath. And that rationale really boils down to what we find in the Ten Commandments in the second version in the book of Deuteronomy. So if you see the first source, remembering that we were slaves in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God freed you from there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore, the Lord your God has commanded you to observe the Sabbath day. That is it in a nutshell. Am I reading the copy? All set? Okay, you're good. Okay, very good. So what's different here? What's the rationale here? It's a keep and remember thing in terms of the essential word, commanding word. That's different for sure. That's enshrined in the Lachadodi poem, which seems to suggest that the two are simultaneous in their utterance, which is another really interesting story in and of itself. Keep is in action. So there is that behavioral kind of thing. What are you supposed to keep it? Now, it doesn't tell you what to do with it. How you keep it is another story. But the reason for doing anything with the Sabbath at all, you were slaves in the land of Egypt. Who gets to rest on the Sabbath according to the Torah? Everybody. Your servants and your animals. There is something that is total in this. There's a totality in that. And this is enshrined in Kiddush on Friday night and elsewhere as well. It is this universal day of rest. Now, from time immemorial, we've been always hearing the Hakim, be a Sabbath observer, it's important, and everything else, right? That's one of the rabbis would go out of business if we didn't tell people they should do this on some level, gently or not. But there is something here that I'd like to get to, which is what is the humanistic, if you will, ideal behind the Sabbath idea? Right?
Then how do you explain the Shabbos Goy? That every shul has that has to work on the Sabbath. Okay,
so there is, just to expand upon that, because I don't know if everybody is quite familiar with the institution. One of the great ironies is that to enable Jews to do the Sabbath in various ways, there would be times when there would be either for pay or for natural agreement, you would find somebody who was not Jewish who would do certain things. Now, in Europe, you would find somebody lighting the fire in the house, or in some other quarters, and it's not as much of an issue for us because we allow the use of electricity. But there would be this phenomenon of, gee, it sure is dark in this room. Oh, maybe you would like to have the light on so you can see what you're doing. I'll just be a beneficiary of that, that kind of thing. And that is an enabling kind of force. In an ideal world, there would not be a need for that. There just would not be. And there would be a sense of, and experientially, there is a remarkable sense of calm and serenity that can be created in a community that can say, we're shutting down a lot of the world for 24 hours. We're letting it be. So in that regard, that would be the ideal thing. And here, the idea being also that it's not just the Jew who is entitled to this, but it speaks to the fundamental idea that there needs to be an attachment to freedom and the dignity of being able to be one's own self and own person. You were slaves in the land of Egypt. One could even make the case, if you can't rest one day out of 7, you're still something of a slave. And that approach is already something that is quite a bit different from what we might call the kind of cosmological, almost semi-mystical approach of saying, look at the heavens are magnificent, God is the ultimate author of life, God pulls back, we should try to do the same thing. That's a magnificent idea too. But alone, if we only had that idea, the concern would be that we're not being sensitive enough to the totality of the experience for others. And that's what this, I think, seems to address. We have one of the most glorious pieces of liturgy or religious experience on Yom Kippur morning. And I think it gets lost a little bit because when people are a little nervous about fasting, they may already start to feel the grumbles of the stomach by 10:30 in the morning. But we have a haftarah. And it's a haftarah that is really, really concerned about not mistaking observing a fast for being a decent person and being sensitive to the needs of others, and not to do it as a mechanical act. But it's more than that. And Isaiah, in our second source here, and we have some ellipses here, but this is in the same chapter, all of chapter 58. What is it the kind of fast that God wants? Source number 2, let me do this here. It's a sensitizing. Unlock the fetters of wickedness. Let the oppressed go free. Share your bread with the hungry. You know that you don't feel so great when you're hungry. Imagine what it's like for people who feel that every single day. Develop a radical empathy. And in the very same chapter, just a little bit further down, it brings in Shabbat. Don't trample on the Sabbath. Stop perusing and pursuing your affairs on my holy day. If you call the Sabbath delight, by the way, that's oneg Shabbat in modern terms, which is more than just pouring tea at the oneg Shabbat afterwards, right? It's true joy. The Lord's day honored, then you can seek the favor of the Lord. So what I think is interesting here is this whole idea, seeking favor of God is a kind of shorthand for saying, what? What would you say? What does it suggest to you?
Being blessed.
Being blessed by God. It's something that God would like to be served authentically, perhaps we might say. And if that's the case, then you have to do two things. If this chapter is to be taken as a whole, you have to engage in what we might call social reform. If there is a lack of sensitivity to the vulnerable, to the poor, to the hungry, you have to change that. But one of the ways in which you do that is to commit generously to the idea of observing the Sabbath. Everybody gets to rest. How you treat others, in other words, is a reflection on how you treat God. We made that point before as a possibility. And it then invites us to take the idea of human dignity into play. Michael?
When I say it, then you can seek the favor of the Lord as a quid pro quo sound. And I'm not sure that that's necessary.
Okay.
In the refrain from to unlock the fetters of wickedness, to oppress go free, there should be sort of a self-satisfaction. I'm not sure it's quite the
Okay. So I think that it's an interesting thing because one of the questions that I'd like to see if we can get to in our 4th hour meeting tonight is the degree to which things like reward and punishment are elements and dynamics that stand by themselves and always ought to be there. Or if in a certain way they are, if you will, a lower level of motivation that is necessary in general, would apply here too, right? And that the ideal is what we call in Hebrew lishma, for its own sake, or for its ideal realization. You don't observe the Sabbath because if you fail to do so, you're going to get zapped somehow, or you'll have some kind of tangible reward, but ultimately because it is what one ought to do to be a part of a covenantal people. Something along those lines. That I think would be the way of framing the question. And here I wonder if something like seeking the favor of God is a kind of shorthand of saying that this is something that God ultimately desires, and one would want, would we not, to be in league with what God would like. Just as when we have the language of the Aldot Ivriot, the midwives to the Israelites who heroically carry out their action of civil disobedience, failing to kill the babies, Israelite babies. And what they're described glowingly for doing so, also, they are Yirei Elohim. They're God-fearing. Now, that's not somebody who's walking around with no sense that they're walking around and reciting psalms or poems and meditating and thinking of God's presence in their lives. They're just acting very beautifully and morally and heroically at their own risk.
Very well. Hearing is. I'm not comfortable exactly with that translation. In that I've seen it translated as revering.
Mhm.
And it's not fearing in the sense of terror or terrorism.
Right.
I mean,
So-
I can understand if it was meant to be you in the presence of somebody who's very great, very important, powerful. And therefore, there's a degree of nervousness that you present yourself. But it's not terror. It's not acting out of terror.
Right. And that is a big thrust of the tradition. And apropos what we were talking about before, there is a debate within a lot of Jewish sources. If there is not, if you will, two levels of what we call the awe or the fear of the Lord. Yet we have that in English, right? I'll put the fear of the Lord in, right? But is it on a lower level? It's called yirat ha'onish, being fearful because you don't want to get punished. And at a higher level, it's called yirat ha'romamut, the awe of God's greatness. In other words, the sunrise and sunset are so magnificent. How can you not be moved by the magnificence of the divine and act in alignment with that? Which, of course, we're more comfortable with, I would think, right? Most of us are. But the issue is, I think, what is the intent in that way? And the major intent, I think, is to say that this is a kind of idiom. It's an idiom of saying that as opposed to there being a overarching, otherwise stated reason why they're doing so. They're doing it because these are women of character who choose to do heroically. And that's the idiom in play. So this whole idea of then saying that to observe something that is loosely associated with the idea of Jewish ritual, because if you think Shabbat, what do you think about? Candles and challah and prayer and great food and all sorts of other nice things like that. Something unique. You don't do it every night of the week. But here is the sense of saying, why is this not an opportunity for looking at the ways in which the well-being and the needs of others are also in play? You deserve to rest. Who else gets to deserve to rest? And to introduce that sense of their needs into our concerns. One of the challenges, to be really honest about Jewish practice and Jewish ritual, if we're not careful, is that it can become a little bit self-serving in the sense that it can be so uniquely enjoyable or focused on what is my home about or what is my personal practice about, that if we're not careful, it can become something that closes the vistas of concern as opposed to opening. If you're fasting, be sensitive to others. If you're having a Shabbat, be sensitive to the well-being of others. That, I think, is the opening point here. And it may not be the first thing I would posit that everybody thinks about when they think of the Sabbath. I wanted to bring in this little tidbit here of something from Sarah Hurwitz's book, which was a lovely little text, more than a text, it's a 250-page book, that talks about the experience of Shabbat from that first angle, if you will. And I think that many of us have encountered this before, that this is something that allows us to let go, to fight consumerism, a mini holiday that puts joy into our lives, helps us to connect with others, a vision of the world as it should be, inspiring us to improve the world as it is. And the title of the book is Here All Along. So this is somebody who's very involved in the political world. She was a speechwriter for both the president and President Obama and the First Lady. This is just one of a slew of books that have come out of people who are saying everything from, here's why I bury my cell phone, my smartphone on the Sabbath, or beyond it sometimes, to I've encountered this day and it has been revolutionary in my life because people never knew that it could have these potentials But I think that one of the things that I like about her presentation here is the idea of what happens at the bottom, inspiring us to see the world as it should be. So rest, dignity, inspiration, vision, these come into play. Now, in a bigger sense, what I think is really being stated here is that one of the key ideas in Judaism is that we should never stop dreaming. We never stop envisioning. We never stop imagining what an idealized future looks like. We have our skeptics. We have even religious skeptics. One philosopher famously said, I believe in my whole heart in the coming of the Messiah as long as he never arrives. Because it's too cataclysmic, too tumultuous. But fundamentally, what if is a very clear Jewish question. And when we ask the what if, it can't be just the private musings of a person. I think the question here is, how do we bring everybody else along with us? How do we make this happen? And this goes back to what we had talked about before when we talk about tikkun olam, the repair of the world, that is both the repair of the world writ large and repair of the world within. How do we have a sense of constant improvement and sensitization to make that happen? That's one of the beneficiaries of a religious art. I would like to posit. With humility, of course, because it's not easy, simple. So, and there are many corollaries to that and other things that we could mention, which of course also speaks about the idea, which is another topic altogether, which I don't have really time to get into tonight. But that's the whole idea of experiencing life as directly and without artificial barriers as possible. If the experience of people and the nuances of encounter, and of course COVID made this very difficult, but if the nuances of encounter require being fully present in the presence of another person, this is Martin Buber's idea of I and thou. It's the idea of the tradition to encounter the other where he or she is, to understand them, truly be able to, before you help, you understand them. You can't do that if everything is entirely through a prism of technology. I think Jewish tradition would rather have us, to the extent possible, being on the playing field itself as opposed to the bleachers. I mean, is an expression of it. It is an expression.
We're talking about hope in that time. How?
Yes, it's entirely. There's a blessing for seeing a crowd of people. Right? How wonderful. Thank you, God, for this magnificent vision of showing us the sheer variety of humanity. That is meant to be awe-inducing. I don't know how many people go to a baseball game at Yankee Stadium that's entirely filled and say that, but it's roughly the kind of thing that one would be, in this case, invited to experience. It's the guts of life. It's not as portrayed. It's as directly in an unmediated way experienced. Okay. Now, I wanted to end our conversations with what is arguably one of the hardest and most significant things of all with regard to religious faith, and really to spend some time with this as a group and to invite your thoughts and to perhaps suggest we should have more conversations about this. I know that all of us on various levels spend a good deal of our time thinking about struggling with, sometimes thinking we might have reached a conclusion with only to have it slip away, all of the experiences of what we call faith and its pesky companion, but necessary companion, I would argue, doubt. And to enter into that, I'd like to take a look at something that really is reflective in the Hebrew Bible, and as well to really frame it in a way that I hope will be helpful before we even get to it. Rabbi Yitzhak Greenberg is one of the most remarkable figures on the American Jewish scene, an ordained Orthodox rabbi whose passion in life has been to promote Jewish pluralism. Having the various denominations think about the other, listen to each other, learn from each other. His famous caustic statement is, I don't care which denomination you're a part of, as long as you're ashamed of it. Right? And he has, in his own way, created, I think, a midrash, if you will, of Judaism as a whole through his own eyes. But one of the things that he has argued for, rather, has been really to help people to come to some sense of a modern perspective of what understanding and God and what faith might be all about. I wanted to introduce this two elements here because they are, I think, both central to where I'd like to go. He says that the difference between an atheist, and I use the word believer, but he uses the word actually theist, somebody who believes in a personal God, is not how much, but how often. Is not how much, but how often. Okay. Any thoughts as to what he might possibly be thinking?
At least the whole sliding scale
A sliding scale.
from never to continually.
Okay. I'm sorry.
I say that this is for a believer, not a believer.
But what about the I'm not certain?
Okay, I'm not certain is not necessarily excluded.
No. I was just, if you've got the believer and the non-believer as exclusive terms, then you have a problem with the middle.
You have a problem with it. And we'll talk about the middle as well, but in fundamental terms, I think he wants to perhaps shift our thinking about this also to the idea that there is not an on and off switch here. Right? It's not the case that somebody maybe has an experience in school or personal experience or through contemplation or what have you, and says, okay, I have filled my cup all the way. I am now a believer. End of concern. And then another person says, try as I might, or I have no desire to try at all. My cup is empty in that regard, and I don't care. That's not really what is true to life experience. Truer to life experience, maybe, according to his suggestion, I think is what he's saying, is that there is the degree to which there's some sense of God awareness in those who do believe in a personal God, and not everybody does. But the sense that there is that intimacy, that relationship, that covenantal link with a personal God may not be there all the time, but it is at least an issue of concern, of hope for somebody. And that may not be the case with somebody who just does not have that as part of their personal agenda. But even the person who has it as a personal part of one's life is going to have moments of drought, moments of plenty, and a lot of things in between.
If you did that. Divine. So basically, don't believe, unbelievers, but this one.
But it's some incident makes them believe for a moment, whatever that moment is, years, wait, that moment.
There,
That's it.
Right, so all of those things may come into play as a possibility. And we can place certain kinds of twists and turns with this and say that is doubting one's doubt a form of belief? It's kind of an endless thing. And I don't want to go down a philosophical rabbit hole here for the simple reason that I'll never get myself out of there, never mind anyone else. But there is this, I think, usefulness, I'll call it, of beginning to think about these things in a more complex way than our culture typically does. And I think that part of the problem is that the people who get the greatest amount of press when it comes to religious life is a carefully drawn partisan distinction between religious folk who are almost overwhelmingly depicted as fundamentalists, on some level, and the secular world that is overwhelmingly presented as, godless atheists,
Right.
and not much in the middle.
Oh, yeah.
I'm too shaky. I could
You
press
can't
the
do
wrong.
A lot of stuff in the middle. Okay. So that's the first thing. The other thing is that distinction we've made before, and I want to just revisit it. Belief that versus belief then. So somewhat famously, Martin Buber, the philosopher of very popular among many people, the author of the I and Thou kind of approach to life, relational Judaism, before that was a more modern term, and relationships being where God is to be found. That's really one of his key ideas. He drew a distinction that the difference between the Greek and the Christian world, early Christian world, and the Jewish world was that the Greek and Christian world really believed in a sense of the necessity of drawing up a list of principles by which one would be defined as either a believer or not. I believe, you can think about the various creeds that came out of the church, or in the medieval period in general. Jews did this too. These are the set principles that define that I am a Jew, I am a Christian, I am a Muslim. Belief that. Versus the idea of belief in, which is much more, I would like to suggest, the idea of the involvement of the entire person in this, either the relationship or the quest for a relationship with a living and viable divine being, which has all of the ups and downs of other kinds of relationships, but it is not. If you think about Maimonides coming up with 13 principles of faith, the Yigdal prayer on Friday nights have them. Believe in the resurrection of the dead, check. I believe that Moses was the most prominent of all of the prophets, check. I believe that God has no body, is fancy word being incorporeal, and has no physical attributes whatsoever, a check. But what does that leave you with at the end? Where does that leave you at the end?
A checklist of performance or non-performance, but it seems to me it's the emotional side.
It is passionless, perhaps, and this plays very powerfully in with the medieval period. I'm going to confess a kind of bias on my part. I suspect I'm not alone, but I have a lot of problems with the medieval philosophical world. And I have a tendency to trace thoughts from the Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh, to the rabbinic period, and then kind of jumping to modernity, which is a very big jump. But the reason is that the medieval world was very, very big on the belief that. And one of the great projects of Maimonides was to demonstrate that belief is a function of mind. The mind, the thought processes. And if one could just think the correct thoughts, so to speak, have the right ways of understanding cognitively what God was all about, that was belief. And one of the problems is that there are many, many classic proofs, or at least attempts at proof, for the existence of God. One of them, which is reminiscent of a ski season, for as long as it lasts, is this teleological argument that you are skiing down the slope and you see halfway down the slope, because of course you can always stop whenever you want to, you see the word shalom written out with boulders halfway down the slope. And then you say, oh, that's interesting. I wonder how that got there. Somebody must have put them there. Because would you expect that to happen without some process? They just randomly fell that way? Of course you wouldn't think that. Okay, I just proved that God exists, because God is like the person who put the stones on the slope. Now I can go down to the rest of the mountain. And 4 or 5 other major proofs like that, but none of them are that clear-cut and airtight that they can't be disproved rationally. And even if you could say with absolute certitude, they are absolutely true, and I prove the existence of God, then what? Then what? Where are you after that? You can't, there was this phrase, the first cause, or the unmoved movement. It's you're playing billiards, and somebody is hitting the cue ball to hit the 8 ball to go into the wrong pocket or whatever there is, right? I always pick the wrong ball. That's when you lose. But there is the sense of, okay, God is like the initial player with the cue stick, and then hitting the ball, hitting the other ball, you get the ball into the pocket. Is that God worth trying to relate to praise, to worship, to have struggle with? There is no potential for that impersonal God to have a relationship with you. The bigger question then is, not is there a God that exists, but from the standpoint, I think, of a Jewish thought process today, I'll frame it this way, and that is, what kind of God we believe might exist? What kind of God do we have relationally capable of, that we can relate to? And how indeed does that make our lives any different as a result? It is opening up a lot. It's opening up a lot. So I want to give just a tad of the biblical approach to the word faith for just a moment, and make, I hope, the case that what the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, defines as faith is not the same as ours in most cases. The next source, when Israel saw the wondrous power which the Lord had wielded against the Egyptians, the people feared the Lord. Sorry, Michael. They had faith in the Lord and his servant Moses. Faith in the Lord and servant. Does that mean that they all of a sudden believed in God before they did not? The same thing in Deuteronomy. The mighty rock are perfect, for all his ways are just. Faithful God, without injustice, he is righteous in them. God is called here by the same term as the people are. So here's the deal. The most common word that everybody knows, I don't have to translate this for anyone of any experience in any religious worship experience, to come to a service, a blessing is said, you know what to say at the end of the blessing. Amen. Okay? What is amen? It's a
one contraction of God is a faithful king.
okay, it's El Melech Ne'eman. Aleph Mem Nun. And in that way of looking at it, God, the faithful king. So you're saying, I mean, I agree with this blessing, this motzi that was just said, so we can have bread. And I agree in that sense, if I'm taking the language of those letters seriously, that God is faithful in bringing forth bread, ultimately. Okay, we have the farmer, we have the distributor, we have everything else, but we also have God as the ultimate source of that. And I invoke, if you will, the divine presence. That faithful piece. And then the word amen is the root of the word in Hebrew for faith, which is emunah. Emunah. And so the argument here is, in that regard, bringing this all together, that in Tanakh at least, for a good piece of it, that the key idea that comes about is that faith is not defined as a belief system, but rather as trust or trustworthiness. God is trustworthy, a faithful God whose justice is righteous and upright. And Israel saw the power, feared the Lord, had faith in him, they trusted. It isn't that they worked out a whole theological system. It's not even that at this point they've had an entire whole history of awareness of the divine, but they have enough of an experience to be able to say, we're going to give this God a chance. There's a sense of trust. I'm using the word Tanakh as Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim, so that would be synonymous with the Bible, the Hebrew Bible. I think you might be on Wednesday nights at Midrash. We have to shift gears, different nights, different texts, I've got to tell you. Okay, no, but I'm glad that you raised it.
Your quotation, like the people at that point, it's almost as if their trust is in Moses. Because you know what happens when he disappears for a while. And it may be that their trust in God is that they trust Moses, and Moses is the source of trust.
Okay, so I imagine that is very parallel. I do. But it's perhaps even a point that makes the case a bit stronger, if you will, because the suggestion is if we can understand how somebody could trust their leader, and we probably all have a pretty fair idea when we've been in situations where we do that, sometimes to be shown to be kind of foolish about it if it didn't work out, but in the meantime, we're trusting. If we can do that, then it's understandable, or at least conceivable, that we might be able to trust in God the same. And this is, I think, a very significant point. I'm sorry for not pushing this forward. I keep forgetting to do that. Okay, I'm trying not to make you dizzy. I really am. So my argument fundamentally is that the idea of faith is a very different kind of thing than what many people understand it to be. I brought in Paul Tillich here, moving from the idea of faith as being as a starting point, biblically speaking, an element of trust or trustworthiness, to the idea of shifting the field a little bit, to the idea of faith being grasped by an ultimate concern. And I happen to like this very much, and I think it's quite Jewish. And I think it's Jewish in the sense that it makes room for doubt. Now, doubt is often portrayed as being the enemy of faith. How dare you have doubts? Aren't you a person of faith? It's destructive. It's hurtful. But it is not necessarily that way. And, Jews and non-Jews alike have made this very same. It's not just that faith and doubt are complementary. Doubt is necessary as a precondition, not a precondition as much as a companion to faith. If you know that water is going to boil at 212 degrees Fahrenheit every time, most times anyhow, you don't have to have any faith in that. You know it. You know it. It's the fact that you have doubts and yet nonetheless are able to give this whole arena an opportunity to try and to pour oneself into the possibility that this is indeed a reality in the world. That is what makes faith possible. Of being able to say that I am concerned enough about the mystery of life, about the totality of experience, and trying to make sense out of it all, that I'm willing to imagine that there is an author of life, and in a Jewish theistic way, a personal God kind of way to say that God cares about goodness and cares about us, then that's much more of a leap. But if you didn't have doubt in the first place, if you absolutely knew that God existed, then there's nothing to have faith for. There's nothing to believe in. It's there. So almost by a point of argumentation, you need to have a kernel of doubt. And
Personal guidance.
And that's why I think that it's a useful thing for moderns to be able to look about and to say, okay, I have doubts, everybody has doubts, but it is not exclusionary to have those doubts. It doesn't put it off the table. Now, I wanted to say something about the personal God piece before we go forward. And here I'm going to just be a little bit, if I can, a little confessional, because I find myself struck by a very, very strong paradox. Many people have read When Bad Things Happen to Good People. You may have read some of the works of Rabbi Harold Schulweis. Both of them to a degree, though Harold Kushner with Bad Things Happen is more to that point. argue for something that we call a naturalistic God. Harold Schulweis, for example, talks about looking at the gerunds, if you remember your grammar, when it comes to God. When you visit the hospital, that's God. When you bury the dead, when you do something to help the hungry, when you do any of these wonderful deeds, that is God. The totality of goodness harvested together is God. Not a supernatural being out there, but very much here. There's also the idea pantheism is having a little bit of a day in the world today. The idea being that everything is in God, and that is the totality of God. The pencil resting on the table and the tree blowing in the wind, quite a bit the last couple of days, and everything in between is God. Nothing separate. Now, that helps a lot when it comes to the humane challenges of what's generally called theodicy, people hurting, people suffering. Because if you, like Kushner, could argue that, this isn't God who's causing the earthquake and everything that's related to that, but rather it is, you find God in all of the forces that are making for recovery. Now, that's a lot more healing than trying to seek the specific reasons why God chose to zap Turkey and Syria recently.
Does that make this on the earthquake small x? And if those are the challenges.
It's part of the challenge, and maybe the reason why we have such a figure as the opposer, the Satan, in the first place, is to be an aid in understanding how terrible things can happen. But suffering is real. Suffering is real. And that may solve a number of human and pastoral issues to be on that level, but it also creates a problem. And the problem is that I don't know how true it is to some of the broad biblical themes we have of God. Genesis teaches that God is outside of the world and creates it. God is above and beyond the world and is separate from the world. God is not a person, but God is open to the potential of being personal with humans, by which then it becomes possible to pray. I don't know how one prays. I don't know if I could pray to a process. Right? If God is the process that makes for goodness and salvation, which Mordechai Kaplan argued, I would find it difficult to pray that way. Would prayer to support Jewish tradition and keep all of those things alive and the melodies going and so forth? Okay, great. It's fine. But in the privacy of one's own heart and in a quiet moment at home, I don't know that I could do that. So it's elusive in that. It's not easy to solve as a dilemma. And I raise that for you. Part of the reason also is that I find it challenging sometimes because we all hurt and we all have had issues and we all have concerns. And we would all love to have much clearer direction and answers. But one of the things that I think kind of as a religious humility here is that we have the issue of your pain and that pain and Zoom pain are unique. And I'm not sure that any one of us could possibly say, here is the exact reason. Therefore, no problem anymore. You must be done with your pain. Here's the solution behind it. I might be able to do that for myself, but I don't know if it's fair to do for you or any of us could do for each other. It's very problematic. Now, the idea of having the combination, some sense of a personal, along with the idea that doubt is legitimate, is that which makes humility possible. If I am able to be on the road, if you will, with my hopeful representation of that which is authentic to, as I best understood, a tradition and covenant, and also speaks to today, they're open to hearing what other people have to say about that, how they view it. I think we're in a better place than saying, here are all the answers. It's very bad. Open up the book. Here it is. So that is another reason why doubt is, I think, useful and even necessary. And the reason I put that little rabbinic phrase here and Susan, this is definitely from the rabbis, it is not in the Tanakh, right? That when the Messiah arrives, the festivals will cease to be observed, but Purim will continue to be observed. I really like that. No more Rosh Hashanah and Kippur with all of the tsuras that it entails for preparation, all that introspection, all of that beating up on oneself, and Passover, oh my God, all of that work that's going to be saved. I'll take my grogger, make some hamakash, and it'll be a machar, right? But of all the holidays, why this carnival-like farce story, right? Farcical story, why is that at the core of what we think?
Well, there is the Midrash that says at Sinai, God held the mountain over the Jewish people and said, you want to accept it, follow the rules or not.
Mhm.
But in the book of Esther, when the Jews are saved, that is when they voluntarily say, this work, in fact, this works, we will accept on a very voluntary basis.
Right.
So when the Messiah comes, that is the signal that voluntary has work and people are conforming is exactly what
At the highest level, the higher level. Yeah.
And therefore, we don't need the other holidays. We
Okay.
are celebrating the acceptance of it.
I think that there's a wisdom to that, and that speaks to the higher level. For footnote, check Rashi on the version of that appears in Shabbat, because he likens that whole sugya, the whole passage about God holding the mountain on top of the people, as an invalid contract.
Okay.
You're an attorney. I had to say this. Okay. But there's one other piece I would add to that, and I like that very much. It's an angle I hadn't thought of. But there's another piece to that, which is two books of the Tanakh don't have God explicitly mentioned: Shir Shirim, Song of Songs, and Esther. At best, God is between the lines. And I think that maybe the author of this midrash is suggesting that in future times, God, even in this writer's time, God is to be detected and to be intuitive more than experienced with the direct thunder and lightning of Sinai and other experiences. And intuition is not something to be neglected. Intuition is the counterpoint to proofs, ironclad height proofs. Take the intuitions and to mold them into a potential project of life transformative engagement seems to me to be something that could be, that which speaks to us. Now, we can't will ourselves to believe. I don't think we want a world where we just wake up one morning, we made the decision and it's done for. But are there human qualities that make it possible to want to will to believe ourselves? I think that there are. And part of those character traits that our tradition and I think rational concerns for life would cultivate can help. But things like gratitude, humility, curiosity, a willingness to be unsettled and have one's life and thinking disrupted a little bit. If one has those traits, that might make it possible for one to have the amen, if you will, out there, and speak to one in a way that otherwise might be different. So faith is multifaceted. Doubt is not an enemy. Doubt arguably is a necessity. Don't fear it. I think that is part of what a modern Jewish approach to this enterprise that we call Jewish religion is very much saying. And at the end of the day, Sefer HaChinuch, text that enumerates all of the mitzvot, states basically, for our purposes, it's worth giving it a try. Hearts are pulled by actions. Think about it, contemplate it, may not be enough. Let's think about it, but let's do something about it too. See what it might well entail. To engage in the actions that would say, it's covenantal living. Here's, I'm going to move this seawall for a couple of minutes anyhow. Oh, there you are. Okay, how are you all doing? Nice to see you. Let me just do this for 2 seconds. Oh, I have to read this one. Because one of the messages of Purim is that we are responsible for stepping up and taking, yes, responsibility for each other. When the Messiah comes, we will still be responsible for each other. That is true. And remembering a point we made last time that about the mitzvot of tzedakah, matanot, name those who are to be supported by help. That is the most important of those mitzvot. So I'm glad I clicked on that. Okay, how do I close it is the question. Okay, close. Okay. Hello, everybody. Let me just close by saying hello. A lot of ways. Oops, I just closed you out. Okay, any last minute questions or thoughts that you'd like to raise?
The higher level than I thought. I knew that.
There you are. It's hard for me not to see you and at the same time while doing this. Okay, we're all together. We're all together. How are you all doing? Okay. Any thoughts, questions, concerns, comments, or ideas for the next 25 lectures and presentations? Okay. Roberta, and then Joel.
I would like to see a continuation of this theme, if you want to help us to understand more of these ideas, because I think a lot of these ideas may be known, some of these ideas may be known to everyone, but not everyone knows all these ideas and more. And I think that this modern approach to study and question is very important for us these days.
Thank you. I appreciate hearing that, Roberta, and it would be helpful for me to hear not only future things that you might wish to explore, and hopefully I could be helpful with, or any of us could be helpful, but also the degree to which the terms that we're using are clear, the basic understandings of things are clear. We're a pretty varied group when it comes to our personal backgrounds, and it's always helpful to hear what you would find to be meaningful. So thank you for raising that. Joel, you are next.
Thank you. So this short course you've called Jewish Ideas That Help Change Lives. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Yes, good. And I always like to think about the links between Jewish ideas, Judaism, and American ideas, America's founding ideas, and what our country and its ideals and Judaism have in common. And so early in this hour, you quoted from Isaiah, and I would just like to mention that I was privileged, and I would not be surprised if others tonight who are present tonight were also privileged on January 20, 1961, to hear a speech that helped change America and that helped change American lives. Because in that speech, President John Fitzgerald Kennedy, his inaugural address, speaking about the Cold War, said, "Let both sides unite to heed in all corners of the earth the command of Isaiah to, quote, undo the heavy burdens and let the oppressed go free," close quote.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I always appreciate that linkage that you like to make, and I've heard you do it before, Joel, and I'm always appreciative of it. And one of the great gifts of our tradition, I think, to Western society has been the prophetic voice of the Isaiahs and the Ezekiels and the Jeremiahs, and the Micahs and so forth. And I would encourage all of us to be able to try to find links like that. To be called to a higher self, not just as individuals, but as a society and as a culture where self-sacrifice and sensitivity to the dignity of others is very important. One other element of this, which we really didn't have a chance to get into, is the relationship between, on an individual basis and a broad cultural basis, Do we believe that there are such things as moral demands? And what is the source of those demands? And if we do believe that they are there, what does a religious perspective do to help us to understand them and to make them more a part of our broader culture? Okay, so we're not going to split hairs on that tonight, but I would encourage us, do you believe, the question, do you believe that there are objective moral demands that just are obligatory? Okay, I'm asking all of us where we are today. What do we think it's not just feeling as a matter of course, because, and that's important as a component. I am moved by somebody's hurt. I want to do something about it. That's fabulous. But is there an objective demand that I do something to help that person? And that arena, if you will, is a significant part of our, I think, of a national conversation, and certainly on a smaller scale. Well, you are a delightful group. Now that I can see you even more so. So thank you everyone for joining us for this little foray into Jewish thinking, and hopefully some thoughts that it can be of help with. And we will continue in other ways. And I hope it's not too early to wish everybody a wonderful Passover. It is too early.
Thank you for the hour of wisdom and inspiration.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
everybody.
you.
Thanks for staying.
Thank
Great to see
you.